Great. So it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure to introduce the next. It's my pleasure to introduce the next keynote speaker, Antonietta Mira. So Antonietta is a professor of statistics at Università della Svizzera, Italiana, Lugano, and Università dell'Insubria, Como. So her research interests include data science, methodological and computational statistics, and she's particularly renowned for her pioneering research in Bayesian inference and Monte Carlo methods. So Antonietta is also a fervent advocate for interdisciplinary collaboration and the dissemination of statistical knowledge to a broader audience. Today, she will talk about intrinsic dimension estimation, and so please join me in extending a warm welcome to Antonietta.
Thanks for the introduction. Thanks to the scientific committee. It's a big honor to be invited for a plenary. And thanks to the organizers. I know how much work this is. So this is joint work with a football team. So the top 6 players are from SISA in Trieste. They are all physicists. On the bottom, we have the statisticians, part from Università della Svizzera Italiana and part from QUT. And I have them with their affiliation at the time they worked on this project. So one of the highlights of this research line is that it's truly interdisciplinary, because we have physicists on one end, statisticians on the other end, plus, for some of the application, knowledge domain experts. And during the process, there were some enlightenments. Those physicists started off as being frequentists, and now we managed to turn them all into Bayesians. This research line started a while ago, 2019, and it's still ongoing. It produced 5 papers, more methodological, 2 more applied, and 2 proceedings. And here comes the disclaimer, because it's ongoing and started a while ago. Some of you might have heard at least part of the topics that I will present, but there are new stuff that will come up, at least in the second half of my presentation. So let me start with a quote, which is also a quiz. Who do you think said this? The non-mathematician is seized by a mysterious shuddering when she hears of 4-dimensional things. She's seized by a feeling which is very similar to the thoughts awakened by the occult. Anybody? So 4-dimensional objects that scare us. Well, a famous 4-dimensional object or construct is space and time. Space and time. So this is Albert Einstein, and he of course refers to the space and time unified framework that he introduced. Indeed, in classical mechanics, space and time were considered as separate entities. And through the special relativity theory, he realized that those are very interwoven quantities, and came up with this unifying framework within which a lot of things became better understood. And in a sense, I can see Michael Jordan Definetti lecture also advocating for a unifying framework between statistics, economics, and computer science. Now, as statisticians, we are often given some data in some dimension that has been collected in some dimension, and we come up with a model that has some parameters, and we're very much used to either expand the dimension of the problem that we are trying to solve, or reduce the dimension of the problem. And this expansion and reduction can happen both on the data space or on the parameter space. Today, I will focus on dimensionality reduction. And it's important to recognize that when we do this either expansion or reduction, things tend to look simpler. Instead of solving the problem as it was handed to us, either looking at it at a higher dimensional level or at a smaller dimensional level makes things easier. So I will try to address two fundamental questions. It's well recognized that real-world data set often contain variables that are not independent, and often a subset of those variables or nonlinear combinations thereof are sufficient to describe the data. And so a natural question that arises is how many and which one of those variables are really needed to summarize the data without a significant information loss. And another relevant question is, what is the appropriate scale at which we should analyze data? Well, these two questions are often considered unrelated and treated separately. But today, I want to push forward the idea that those two questions are strongly related and entangled, and we will put forward a unifying framework, which I could call a scale dimensional framework, that addresses both questions in a self-consistent way. So we will introduce an approach in which the optimal number of variables and the optimal scale at which to look at the data to really see the signal-to-noise ratio is determined self-consistently. And bypassing the noise that often comes with the data allows us to really see the big picture and identify the intrinsic dimension of data. So those are two very complicated questions. Let me start with an easier question. So here you see points that were originally connected in 3 dimensions. And the question is, can you guess what is the dimension of the support of the data generating process? And we call this dimension lowercase d. Well, you can see that there is some structure. Those are 2 projections, 2 views of the same 3-dimensional data. Well, if I show you this, you soon realize that in this data there are only 2 degrees of freedom, x and y, and then there is a deterministic map that maps them in a 3-dimensional object. So in this setting, we call capital D the original dimensional of the data, and lowercase d, which in this setting is 2, the intrinsic dimension of the data. And this intrinsic dimension is needed for manifold learning. David Dunson and co-authors have worked a lot on this. It's needed when we want to do regression, when the covariates are constrained to live on a manifold, and Judith and co-authors have addressed this. And it's a key concept also in unsupervised learning and feature selection. And in a sense, provides a lower bound to the number of variables that are needed to describe a system. Estimating the intrinsic dimension comes with at least 3 orders of problems. The first one is that data comes with noise, and noise makes the identification of the intrinsic dimension harder. For example, consider this data that was originally contracted in 3 dimensions, but the data is really living on a 1-dimensional line plus noise. If we look at this data too closely, it seems that the dimension is 3. If we zoom out a little, it seems that the dimension is 2, and only if we zoom out sufficiently out, we really see that this data is 1-dimensional. Of course, if we zoom out too much, everything looks like a point, and its dimension seems to be 0. So how much do we want to zoom out the data to clearly see the picture? Well, the answer is we need to zoom out sufficiently to bypass the noise and see the intrinsic dimension. The second problem is that often within a given data set, there is more than one manifold where a subset of the data are constrained to live. So often there's not just a single intrinsic dimension, but the intrinsic dimension can vary within the same data set. And we will exploit this fact to gain insight into the data structure. And we will develop an approach to, in a sense, cluster the data into regions that have the same intrinsic dimension. For example, here we have 5,000 observations generated from 5 Gaussian distributions. The first 1,000 observations are from a 1-dimensional Gaussian distribution, The second 1,000 are from a 2-dimensional Gaussian distribution, and then we have a 4, a 5, all the way to a 9-dimensional Gaussian distribution. And you see that the 1-dimensional Gaussian, the black dots, are totally embedded in the 2-dimensional points. And it's not easy to disentangle and identify the manifolds. The framework that I will put forward will allow us to say, look, in this data set, there are 5 submanifolds. This is their intrinsic dimension, and these points belongs to these submanifolds. The third problem is well highlighted in the top right panel of this picture that comes from a paper by David, JRSSB. In this top right, you see remote sensed chlorophyll data in the RLC. And this data is intrinsically discrete. So I will first introduce estimators of the intrinsic dimension for continuous setting, and then we will focus on discrete data. So we will apply those estimators that I will explain in different settings, or we have applied throughout this time. Some settings are biomedical, protein folding, fMRI data, or gene expression data. We have applications to finance, to sport data, of course, pandemic data, who has not analyzed COVID data, and then network type of data, and I will focus on this application towards the end. And there are 2 other ways we can exploit the intrinsic dimension that we have studied. We have looked at the intrinsic dimension of the output of a Markov chain Monte Carlo simulation targeting some posterior distribution. And by looking at the intrinsic dimension, we can understand whether the problem is well identified. And similarly, we have looked at the intrinsic dimension of layers of a convolutional neural network or of transformers in large language models. And again, something interesting comes out. So a simple topological feature, like the intrinsic dimension, allows us to uncover a rich data structure in all these examples. So what is this intrinsic dimension? Well, there are many definitions in the literature. The one that I like as a statistician is the dimension of the support of the data generating distribution. And in the literature, there have been different approaches to estimate this intrinsic dimension. Some are projective, some are topological, some are based on the notion of nearest neighbors. There's a lack of a statistically sound approach to estimating the intrinsic dimension, and this is what we are trying to bring. So the aim is to directly target the intrinsic dimension as a parameter that we want to estimate. And we recognize that one of the fundamental issues is this scale dependence, the scale at which we look at the data, which is strongly related to the fact that data is noisy. And we will take a nearest neighbor approach because this is the approach that allows us to give some statistical guarantees to our estimators that will allow to provide uncertainty quantification, and we will have some either exact or asymptotic distributional results. So I will introduce 2 classes of estimators of the intrinsic dimension that are based on nearest neighbors. The first class, which is called the nearest neighbor order. The second class is called nearest neighbor distance. So consider a generic point in the data set. In the first class, we fixed 2 nearest neighbor orders, say N2 and N1. And we find the distance from point I, or from any point in the data set, to those 2 nearest neighbor. We call those 2 distances Ri N2 and Ri N1. We take N2 to be bigger than 1, so the first distance is larger than the second one. And the statistics that we study to estimate the intrinsic dimension is the ratio of the distances from the N2 to the N1 nearest neighbor. Within the second class, instead of fixing nearest neighbor orders, we fix 2 distances. So again, we focus on a point. We fix 2 distances, R2 and R1, and we count the number of points within that distance from I. We call NIR2 the number of points within distance R2 from I, and NI R1. And the statistics that we will study is the number of points within the smaller ball, conditioning on knowing the number of points in the larger ball. So for those two statistics, we provide their distribution. And it's interesting that those two statistics have a distribution that is solely a function of the intrinsic dimension. And having derived the distribution, this gives us a handle to come up with estimators. So within the first class, I will introduce the two nearest neighbor estimator, which is the ratio of second to first nearest neighbor distance, the GRIDE estimator that handles generalized ratio of distances, the Hidalgo that consider finite mixture of two nearest neighbor ratio, and the Bayesian parametric version of Hidalgo. Within the second class, I will introduce the I3D, intrinsic dimension for discrete data, the binomial intrinsic dimension estimator, its adaptive version, and its Bayesian adaptive version. So these are the estimators that I will introduce throughout my talk. And each one of them solves one of the problems that I mentioned at the beginning. First, the two nearest neighbor estimator requires a weak local homogeneity assumption of an underlying Poisson process that I will soon introduce. And all estimators that were available in the literature before these estimators that we introduced relied on a global homogeneity assumption, so we relaxed this assumption. The GRIDE estimator is more robust than the two nearest neighbor estimator to noise in the data. The Hidalgo and the BNP Hidalgo are robust to settings where there's more than one intrinsic dimension or more than one manifold hidden in our data. And then the adaptive intrinsic dimension estimator allows us to escape the noise and get the clear picture of the data. And then there's the adaptive version of the intrinsic dimension estimator for discrete data. So I'll set the notation with some drawings, so it will stick into your mind. There's not much notation, but it's important notation. So given a point I in our data set, we let xi1 be the first nearest neighbor to point I. And we let ri1 to be their distance. Easy. And this notation will be used within the first class of estimators. Then we'll also talk about the volume of shells and the volume of balls. So those shells and balls are centered in xi, and vi1 is the volume of the first shell, and capital Vi1 is the volume of the first ball centered at xi. Of course, the first one, shell and ball, coincide, but then the ball is the sum of shells. Then we go from the first nearest neighbor to the second nearest neighbor, the third, and in general to the jth nearest neighbor. So again, we focus on xi, a point in our data set, and we let xij be the jth nearest neighbor of point I. And we let rij be their distance. And within the class of estimators of the intrinsic dimension based on nearest neighbor order, the first estimator is the ratio of distances from the second to the first nearest neighbor. And we prove that this quantity has a Pareto distribution, and the parameter of the Pareto distribution is the intrinsic dimension. And this is true for every point mu I. Then, having generalized the notion of nearest neighbor, we also have the successive volumes of shells, Vi1, Vi2, Vi3, and similarly for the balls. Those concepts are needed to prove that Pareto distribution result. Now we move to the notation that we need for nearest estimators that are based on distant classes. Again, we focus on a generic point in our data set. We define a radius that identifies a ball, A, and we let Ka be the number of points within that ball. And then we can consider another ball, B, which is larger than A, and we let Kb be the number of points within ball B. And the second statistics that we will consider is the distribution of Ka, number of points in the smaller ball, given Kb, which is easy to prove that it's as a binomial distribution, and crucially, the success probability of this binomial distribution is related to the intrinsic dimension of the data. So this is the notation, and now let's try to be a little bit more formal and look at the modeling framework. So we're given a probability space, and we consider n random vectors taking values in a d-dimensional metric space, MD. And then, within this metric space, we consider a Borel subset A with a volume VA. And now, let's take a function, h, from MD to the positive real line, and we assume that this function is constant over the set A, n equal to rho. And we assume, and this is the distributional assumption that we make, that the number of points in the set A, which we denote with Ka, as a Poisson distribution with parameters given by the volume of the ball A times rho, this constant parameter. Now, if the function h is constant on all subset of our metric space, then the collection of Ka is an homogeneous Poisson point process. And this is the underlying object on which all our results will rely. Now, the main assumption is that those data, well, besides this Poisson point process assumption, lie on a manifold of intrinsic dimension lowercase d, and that we compute volumes in Rd. So the volume of the hyperspherical shell Vij, remember lowercase v are the shells, as an expression, don't focus on the expression, but crucially this expression is a function of the intrinsic dimension. And similarly, the volume of the sphere, which is the sum of these volumes of the shells, also is a function of the intrinsic dimension. So this Vik is the sphere centered at I up to the kth nearest neighbor. We will assume that the Poisson distribution or the Poisson process has an intensity, rho I, which is constant within this unit sphere. And from this assumption, we can prove, well, it follows that the volumes of the shells are IID exponential random variables. And the volume of the spheres being sum of exponential random variable as an Erlang distribution, and ratios of exponential and Erlang as a Pareto distribution. So, given these assumptions, we now give, or I now give you, the distributional result of this quantity mu I, n1, n2. So n1 and n2 are two positive integers, n2 bigger than n1. And we look at, for every point I in our data set, at the ratio of the distance between that point and its n2 nearest neighbor divided by the distance of at that point to the n1 nearest neighbor. And under the assumptions given before, this quantity has a distribution that we can derive in closed form, and this distribution, crucially, only depends on the intrinsic dimension of the data. And the proof was given by Francesco Denti, who is sitting somewhere in the audience. It was part of his PhD thesis. By the way, pretty much all the collaborators worked on these projects during their PhD thesis, or are still working. So the proof of these distributional results follows from the local homogeneity assumption of this underlying Poisson point process. In the special case where we take n2 to be 2 and n1 to be 1, this distribution becomes the Pareto distribution. And this is the two nearest neighbor estimator for which those physicists derived the maximum likelihood version. And when I joined the team, I said, well, let's be patient. And it was easy, because the conjugate prior to the Pareto distribution is the gamma, the posterior is therefore also gamma. We simply update the parameters as we know. And under square error loss function, we look at the posterior mean. And as we all know, the posterior mean is asymptotically equivalent to the maximum likelihood estimator. And so this is the 2 nearest neighbor estimator. The GRIDE estimator, generalized ratio intrinsic dimension estimator, looks at a ratio of distances between N2 and N1 nearest neighbor rather than just second to first. And typically we take N1 to be N2 divided by 2. So let's focus on those two estimators. The 2 nearest neighbor, let me repeat, is the ratio of second to first nearest neighbor. The GRIDE is the ratio of N2 to N1 nearest neighbor. They both rely on the homogeneity assumption of the Poisson process. And when we build the likelihood, of course, we are also assuming that those mu i's are independent, an assumption that is often violated if 2 points share nearest neighbors. But we're fairly robust to violation of this assumption. So the 2 nearest neighbor estimator, for the 2 nearest neighbor estimator that only looks at ratio of second to first nearest neighbor, this local homogeneity assumption of the underlying Poisson process is less stringent because we want it to hold only at the distance of the second nearest neighbor. On the other hand, for the GRIDE estimator, the local homogeneity of the Poisson process has to hold all the way to the N2 nearest neighbor. On the other hand, for the 2 nearest neighbor, the independence assumption is harder to achieve because it's much easier that 2 points share either the first or the second nearest neighbor. On the other hand, if you look at large values of N2 and N1, the independence assumption, it's easier to enforce. The 2 nearest neighbor has the added value that the estimator has a closed form expression. The negative side is that it's sensitive to noise. Looking at only the second nearest neighbor does not typically allow us to bypass the noise in the data and see the clear picture, because typically the noise extends beyond the second nearest neighbor. On the other hand, the GRIDE estimator is robust to noise, but we do not have a closed form expression for the estimators. So if we are Bayesian, we have to rely to MCMC simulation. But that's easy. We all know how to do that. It turns out that the variance and the bias of the GRIDE estimator is reduced relative to the one of the 2 nearest neighbor estimator. And in a sense, there is an intuition behind this because we gather from the data more information on the topology of the manifold. So how do we choose the value of N2 in the GRIDE estimator? Well, in the first paper, we were advocating the idea of looking at the GRIDE path. So estimating the intrinsic dimension at increasing values of N2. And this amounts to, in a sense, zoom out of the data. And when you zoom out sufficiently far and you finally see the geometry of the data, this estimated intrinsic dimension reaches a plateau, and this is the value that we report. Now we have a better way to choose the value of N2 thanks to the work of Antonio Di Noia, a current PhD student at Università della Svizzera Italiana, jointly at ETH Zurich. And we'll get back to this. Before telling you how to optimally choose the value of N2, let me move to try and solve the second issue. The GRIDE estimator allows you to zoom out and bypass the noise. This was the first problem that we tried to solve. The second problem is what happens if in our data set there's more than one manifold and some of the points live in different submanifolds. For example, here we have 3 submanifolds and we want our methodology to be able to identify these manifolds. So in this case, we introduced the Hidalgo estimator. This was again in the PhD thesis of Francesco Denti. So the idea is very simple. Instead of looking at the 2 nearest neighbor estimator, a ratio of second to first nearest neighbor, we take a mixture of Pareto distribution, a k-dimensional mixture where k, well, a mixture of k components, where k is the number of manifold. And then K is a parameter, and we can do model selection to pick the optimal value of K through BIC, for example, or we can do model comparison. Good. So we then build our likelihood by looking at product over the points. And as Bayesian, we need to put priors on now the vector of intrinsic dimensions, which is a k-dimensional vector, the vector of mixing probabilities, well, then form the posterior distribution proportional to priors and the likelihood. And also in this case, there are natural choices of conjugate prior. For dk, the intrinsic dimension of the kth manifold, we take a gamma prior. For the mixing probability, we take a Dirichlet prior, and then we play the usual trick of estimating mixture component. That is, we enlarge the parameter space, introducing those Zi indicators that are discrete variables that take values between 1 and k. K, remember, is the number of manifold or mixture component. And we do the usual thing that as Bayesian we are familiar with to estimate a mixture of distribution, Pareto in this setting. Unfortunately, things didn't work out quite as well as we were hoped, and we realized that because Pareto densities with different value of the parameter have a high overlap, especially in the tail, we needed to add an additional assumption, which is a very natural assumption. That is, we needed to assume that different manifolds are well separated in space, and that if you are my neighbor, it is more likely than not that we share the same intrinsic dimension. So with this additional assumption that I've now stated in words, but it has a formal definition, we could estimate the intrinsic dimension of very interesting data set. I will briefly go through some of the applications. So this is a molecular dynamics application. We look at the Wilnig Hep piece, a protein that goes from a folded to an unfolded state. The data comes from a paper in Nature. And we have 32,000 configuration. This is the number of, in a sense, data points in our set. And for each configuration in this paper, they reported 32 dihedral angles between the molecule in the protein. Without going into much details, the Hidalgo methodology allows us to identify very clearly 4 manifolds. 3 of them have intrinsic dimension around 12, 13, and 1 has a much higher intrinsic dimension, 23. And ex post, by looking at the protein that end up, the protein configuration that end up in each one of these manifold, we realize that the folded state of the protein almost always, or most of the times, end up in the manifold with higher intrinsic dimension. Second application, fMRI data. We have 30,000 voxel in an fMRI experiment when the person was doing some visual model task. We have 202 scans. This is the original dimension. The data was given to us. We apply Hidalgo, and we identify clearly 2 very distinct submanifolds, one of dimension 16 and one of dimension 32. Notice the dimensionality reduction. And ex post, by looking at which voxel belong to which submanifold and discussing this with the knowledge domain expert, the neurologist, we realized that the task-relevant voxel, remember the person was doing some task, and the neurologist know which part of the brain is involved typically when performing the task. So those task-relevant voxel, most of them end up in the manifold with higher intrinsic dimension, while the low-dimensional manifold, dimension 16, mostly contains noisy voxel. The third application I want to tell you about is related to financial data. Here we have 8,000 companies. From CompuStat database, we collect 31 balance sheets indicators. We apply our Hidalgo methodology. We identify 4 submanifolds of intrinsic dimension 5, 6, 7, and 9. And ex post, we realized that the companies that end up in the manifold with smaller intrinsic dimension are those companies that have a worse rating in terms of S&P, so have D, C, or B minus type of rating. On the other hand, as the manifold increases dimension, companies in the manifold with larger intrinsic dimension have a better rating, A or A+. So low-dimensional manifold companies in the lower dimension manifold tend to have lower rating, which also makes some sense. Lower intrinsic dimension means less degrees of freedom in playing with your balance sheets. And we know these companies have some freedom in putting numbers in their balance sheets. But if the company is not doing well, there's less degrees of freedom and therefore lower intrinsic dimension. The next step from the mixture of K Pareto distribution is go to an infinite mixture of Pareto distribution. And this gives rise to the Bayesian nonparametric Hidalgo estimator. And again, we do the usual thing that we would do as Bayesian when we want to estimate the infinite mixture of Pareto distribution. So we adopt the Dirichlet process prior on the parameters. So I will not go into the details, but we didn't do anything more fancy than what you would do. And using this Bayesian nonparametric Hidalgo, we automatically get an estimator of the number of manifold without needing to do model comparison. And let's go back to the motivating example on simulated data. Remember, these are Gaussians, and we have 5 submanifolds, each one containing 1,000 points. So the BNP Hidalgo clearly tells us that there are 5 submanifolds. And in this plot, the green lines is the true intrinsic dimension. The red line is the estimated intrinsic dimension through the median of the intrinsic dimension of each point. By the way, as a subproduct of both the Hidalgo and BNP Hidalgo, for each point, we have an intrinsic dimension. We have a posterior even intrinsic dimension. So we have the median of the posterior intrinsic dimension estimator. So for the points in the 9-dimensional Gaussian that are very well separated, remember those points here, the red ones, we clearly identified them. We clearly identified the intrinsic dimension being 9. That's very easy. For the first 1,000 points, well, that was a very hard problem. Remember, they are completely embedded in the second and partly in the third submanifold. So we identified that there is a manifold of intrinsic dimension equal to 1. Here it is. We estimate properly that intrinsic dimension, but we wrongly allocate some of the points that should be in this manifold to the second manifold. This is a very hard problem. We were very happy with the results, well, despite it's not perfect. Real application of the BNP Hidalgo. This is joint work with knowledge domain expert from the Institute of Oncology Research, associated with Università della Svizzera Italiana, Luciano Cascione, has challenged us, say, okay, apply your methodology on this data that come from 2 papers in Nature Communication. So we have about 17,000 genes expression data recorded on 69 tissues. The first 38 are samples of patients that are affected by a diffuse large B-cell lymphoma, and the remaining 31 are control groups. Now, the BNP Hidalgo tells us there are 2 manifolds. The first one has intrinsic dimension about 7. Notice the dimensionality reduction from 1700 to 7, and contains, crucially, all the patients and some of the controls. The other manifold has intrinsic dimension around 13 and contain most of the controls. Now, there is some color coding, and I will get back to this example and explain to you the color coding of these points later on. Here on the y-axis, we have the posterior median of the intrinsic dimension of each sample tissue. So Luciano and their group were very happy with this methodology, but they asked the question, okay, fine, you're telling me that our data is not really living in a 17 1,000-dimensional space, but is constrained to live in either 7 or 13-dimensional space. And they ask, can you give me the representation in this lower dimensional space of the gene expression of each one of the patient? Okay, so this question sparked a new research line, and I hopefully will have time to tell you a little bit about that. In light of time, I will skip this application where we look at the intrinsic dimension of layers in a convolutional neural network. There is some very interesting pattern here. And we move to the second class of estimators. So this is the same modeling framework we started off with. So we have a space, we have a Borel subset, we have this intensity which is constant over A, and the number of points within A have a Poisson distribution. And now we add another subset, B, that contains A, and we assume that the constant intensity is not only over A, but also over B, this superset. And we look at the conditional distribution on the points in the smaller subset, given the number of points in the larger subset. Well, clearly this is a binomial distribution, and crucially, the success probability of this binomial distribution is related to, well, the volume of the two sets times rho, which is the intensity, and this intensity cancels. Now, if the metric space is now the Euclidean metric space, and we measure distance in RD, then this success probability is equal to the ratio of the distances of the radii of the ball A to the ball B to the power D. So this distance of radii, we call it tau, radii. We call it tau, and we'll get back to this tau later on. If instead of working on a Euclidean space, we work on a discrete lattice, then using the same framework, we will derive the intrinsic dimension estimator for discrete metrics. So having this distributional result, we have a likelihood, assuming again independence, but as I said, we're fairly robust if we forget about the correlations that are there, but they don't affect too much our estimators. And again, we have the maximum likelihood estimator derived from this conditional distributional result and the Bayesian version. So we put a prior now on P, the success probability of the binomial distribution. The conjugate prior is beta. We get a posterior prior, so we have the Bayesian estimator for P, and from the Bayesian estimator for P, we derive the Bayesian estimator for D, which is a function of P through a change of variable. And we have its mean and its variance. Those two, of course, are asymptotically equivalent in N. But now the question is, how do we fix TB, which is the radius of the largest ball, which is equivalent to fixing the value of N2, remember in the other class, how far we go, how much do we zoom out in our data. So this is a crucial problem, and here is how we solve it. So letting N2 change, or letting TB, the radius of the largest ball, change, gives us a class of intrinsic dimension estimators. And we want to pick within this class the right estimators, which amounts to deciding how far we want to zoom out when we look at the data. And we do this by comparing two models. I will skip the distributional or the geometric details. But basically, we compare two models. The first one assumes that the intensity of the underlying Poisson process is constant between I and its k+1 nearest neighbor. And the second model, on the other end, actually, the first model assumes that it's not constant, it varies. And the second model assumes that it's constant. So we have an underlying Poisson process. We're assuming that its intensity is constant locally. But how local is local? We decide how local is local by comparing those two models. And this comparison can be done with a likelihood ratio test. We have closed form expression for the likelihood. We have closed form expression for the maximum likelihood estimators, for their variance. So doing likelihood ratio test is very easy. As an alternative, as Bayesians, we could do BIC. We know that BIC is equivalent to likelihood ratio test for some values of the number of points, which for us is k. Or we can be more fancy and do Bayes factor. And as a matter of fact, this is a sequential testing procedure. But one way or the other, we are able to identify how far we need to zoom out to bypass the noise and see the clear picture. And this was work by Antonio Di Noia, not only the proof, but also the implementation of this algorithm. And I will not go into the details of this algorithm, but I will highlight that it's an iterative algorithm, because in order to find the optimal value of k, we need to know the intrinsic dimension. So this is why at the beginning I said that we come up with a unifying framework where we estimate the intrinsic dimension and the distance at which we want to bypass the noise consistently and at the same time. So we start out with the 2 nearest neighbor estimator. This is how we initialize the algorithm that requires no input and then we do an iterative procedure where at each step we do this testing of assumption, decide how large should the neighborhood be for each point, crucially. The value of the noise can be different at different parts of the space. So we find the optimal number of neighbors to be considered for each point in the space. And then we stop this algorithm if the estimated intrinsic dimension at the current at the previous step are sufficiently close. And the algorithm returned the estimated intrinsic dimension with this adaptive framework. This is called the adaptive BIDE. And we have the Bayesian version. And returns the value of ki, the optimal neighbors for each point. So you see in this toy example that depending on where you are in the space, so for this point I, where there's a smooth variation of the density of points, we can afford having a fairly large neighborhood where the density of points is constant. On the other hand, for this point here, where there's a large variation of the density of points, the neighborhood that we have to look, it's smaller. And within 3 iterations at most, in all the applications that we have seen, this algorithm converges and returns the estimated intrinsic dimension, as well as, for each point, the largest neighborhood that we should be considering. In this case, the intrinsic dimension is 1, and we start off estimating it to be 2, but then in few steps we converge to 1. Antonio was able to prove that this algorithm converges. The resulting estimators is consistent, and we can provide uncertainty quantifications, either relying on the asymptotic normality of the maximum likelihood estimator or invoking a Best-Transformations theorem, and in this case we will use the asymptotic variance of the Gaussian distribution, which is the Fisher information. So we have a measure of the uncertainty of the resulting estimators. To answer the question that the colleague Luciano Cascione that gave us the gene expression data, we managed to modify the local linear embedding algorithm. LLE, it's an algorithm, is an unsupervised learning algorithm that computes the low-dimensional projection of points, and was introduced in a paper in Science in 2000 and got up to now over 20,000 citations. This LLE algorithm requires 2 inputs, K and D. And our algorithm, to estimate the intrinsic dimension, returns those 2 inputs, K and D. So our estimator for the intrinsic dimension returns D, which is a dimension where we want to project down, and returns K, which is the number of nearest neighbor that we should consider. So it's natural to take our estimator, the output of our estimator, and to feed into the local linear embedding algorithm and come up with an adaptive local linear embedding algorithm. I will not go into the details, but basically it's the same algorithm in the original paper, so it has convergence guarantees with an adaptive feature. And we went back to the diffuse cell lymphoma data, remember, 17,000 genes on 69 tissues. 38 are patients, and on the patients, remember, there were two colors, are two types of cells, ABC and GCZG, and 31 healthy donors with different color codings. And the different color coding refer to the maturation of these B cells. And the TCP and the APC cell are cells that are healthy but at a higher stage of maturation. So we applied our local linear embeddings. Remember, this was the result of the BNP Hidalgo, clear separation of the cases and the controls, but we had those controls that ended up in the smaller dimensional manifold. And crucially, those gray and red cells are the TCP and the APC cells, that they have the highest level of maturation. And now, by using this LLE star, we managed to identify 3 clusters. So we project down onto the intrinsic dimension that we find, and there we do the clustering. And here are the cases. Here are the controls, and here are the controls that ended up in the smaller dimensional manifold. So it's nice to have this picture being clarified, and those we're very happy to get these results. So in the last 3 minutes, I'll tell you something about the discrete version of those estimators. So this is in a paper published in the Physics Review Letters, and I thank Yuri for the slides. Those are the slides for presentation of his PhD thesis, and I've elaborated them. So the starting point is the same. So we have points falling in a volume, red volume, and we let K with the number of points in the red volume. We have a smaller volume, blue volume, and we let N be the number of points in the blue volume. And as before, as in the BIDE estimator, the distribution of N given K, number of points in the smaller given the number of points in the larger volume, is binomial with the success probability, which is the ratio of volumes times this rho, which is assumed to be constant, so it simplifies. Now that we are in a discrete state space, unlike what we did in the BIDE estimator, we measure the volumes not through the ratio of the balls, but using the number of points that end up in those volumes, assuming that there is an embedding manifold that has a certain intrinsic dimension. So to enumerate the lattice point in a region, we use Herard polynomials that Herard gave in a paper in 1977, a formula for, given a radius and the intrinsic dimension of the lattice, the number of points that end up in a volume with that radius. So using this formula, we can compute the volumes in the binomial distribution. Those volumes do depend on D, and this allows us to either do, again, maximum likelihood estimation of D, or as Bayesians, we do put a prior, and we estimate the posterior D with the posterior mean. So we use this intrinsic dimension estimator in networks. But before going to networks, let me show you how it behaves on fractals. So if you've been walking around Venice these days, you might have seen a lot of fractal objects. Those are pictures taken from the illustration of a Ruskin book, The Stones of Venice. This is a compendium of the architecture of the Venetian, Byzantine, Gothic, and Renaissance period. Now, if we look at the intrinsic dimension of fractals objects, like the Koch snowflakes or the Sierpinski gasket, that have a very well-defined intrinsic dimension, which is 1.3 for the Koch snowflake and 1.6 for the Sierpinski gadget, and we apply our estimator and compare it with alternative ways of estimating the intrinsic dimension, like box counting or fractal dimension, we identify the proper intrinsic dimension better than the alternative estimators that are available in the literature. And then we compute the intrinsic dimension of a network. We all know what is a network. We focus on networks with which are undirected and unweighted, but this can be extended. We measure distances between two nodes as the shortest path. And for each network, we have a vector of intrinsic dimension depending at the scale at which we look at the data. This is an example that I can skip. But what's important is then we use this vector within ABC procedure as the summary statistics that allows us to estimate the parameters of a network. And we look at the intrinsic dimension signature, we call it signature because it's a vector, of real-world network, like Amazon recommendation, Google, Facebook, or yeast protein, or US power grid. And each one of those networks has a very distinct signature that has some common trends. First increases and then decreases, and how sharp it increases depends on whether in the network there are hubs or not. And within ABC, we look at this summary statistics, which has the peculiarity of capturing the behavior of the network at different scale, not only local scale or global scale, like other measures, like the degree distribution or the diameter, but also at mesoscale. So through this ID signature, we really get a picture of the network at different scales. And we use it in ABC, and we can, by only matching, using these summary statistics, estimate the parameters of real-world network or simulated network. So the summary statistics that we use in ABC, this is a sketch of ABC, and the summary statistics that we use is the maximum discrepancy between the intrinsic dimension of the observed network and the intrinsic dimension of the simulated network. And just by matching these two vectors, we automatically also capture other properties of the network that we don't explicitly match for. So I will stop here. Of course, we use SMC ABC and not the rejection ABC. And I have some examples that show how well this works, but I will stop here. Thanks.
Okay, so we've got time for one or two questions. Yeah.
Thanks. Very interesting. I was just maybe I missed something, but at the beginning you were explaining that you could have noise around observations on the manifold, and what you would capture is the dimension of the underlying manifold. Like in your theory, is it what you get, or are you assuming that the points live on the manifold?
No, this is what we get. Well, we assume that the points live on a manifold, and we estimate the intrinsic dimension of the manifold.
Okay, but if there is a bit of noise around,
yes,
then it's not quite clear what you're capturing, is it, or is it clear?
If there is noise, we still capture the intrinsic dimension because we managed to bypass the noise by zooming out with this mechanism. And we can tell how much we should zoom out to bypass the noise and capture the true intrinsic dimension of the data. Thanks, Judith.
By
the way, these are the references.
Hi, thank you, Antonietta. Very nice. I have two curiosity, quite quick. One is related with the previous question. Are you also able to estimate the manifold? Can you also have something like that? And the second is, how strong is the assumption about homogeneity, the point process stuff? So your results strongly depend on that. Can you use some more general point process and have some more general result?
So at this stage, let me start with the second question, thanks. The assumption is crucial. Everything relies on local homogeneity, but I'll be happy to discuss with you or others, experts of some point processes, how this can be extended to more, maybe, yes, mixture of some processes with intensities that, well, as a matter of fact, it's already, it's local homogeneity. So the intensity is not constant everywhere. It's only locally constant. So that assumption is crucial. It underlines all the proofs that we have. And the first assumption, the first question is, no, we don't have we don't estimate the manifold. We only assume that it's locally linear. And this assumption allows us to do the locally linear embedding, so find the projected version of the capital D points in the lower dimensional D. But we do not get the manifold as a result. We get the projected value of the original points in the lower dimensional manifold, assuming that it is locally linear. So in a sense, yes, we have a local linear approximation of the underlying manifold. But yes, it's a local linear approximation. Thank you.
Great. So let's thank Antonietta again. And so we... So there's the lunch break, and then we've got a poster session at 1:30.
Yes, I tried.